Afternoon and good morning, everyone, and welcome to CGLCC Connects, a Fireside Chat with the Honourable Erin O'Toole. Today we are connected virtually, but it is important to recognise the land on which the CGLCC office sits. We are gathered on the territory of the Mississaugas of New Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. These lands are historically governed by the Treaty of the Dish with One Spoon, a treaty between these Indigenous nations that solidified their commitment to share the territory and to protect the land and water. Let us take a moment to think about how we can honour the treaty's spirit of peace, friendship and respect. I invite you all to acknowledge the land on which you are joining us. My guest today is the Honourable Erin O'Toole, the leader of Canada's Conservatives, and has served as leader of the opposition since August 2020. After 12 years of service, Mr. O'Toole retired from the military and spent the next decade working in the private sector as a corporate lawyer. He is the founding member of the board of directors of the True Patriot Love Foundation, a charity that serves veterans and military families across Canada. He has been elected to represent Durham 3 times, first in a 2012 by-election, then in 2015 and 2019. He served as Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade before becoming Minister of Veterans Affairs. After serving as the Conservative Shadow Minister of Foreign Affairs for 2 years, Mr. O'Toole is now the leader of Canada's Conservatives. Mr. O'Toole, you're very welcome to our conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Dale, and thank you for your invitation months ago. And I'm glad we can get together for this fireside chat and speech during Pride Month, a month where we celebrate triumphs and successes of the LGBTQ community and remember some of the hardships and tragedies and recommit ourselves to ending discrimination, homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia. I certainly wish we could be doing this together in person. We're getting close to those days, but it is great to join you virtually to discuss ways that we can work with your group and LGBTQ entrepreneurs as part of Canada's economic recovery post-COVID-19. I also want to start off by saying how proud I am to be joined by my colleague, MP Eric Duncan. Eric is a first-term member of Parliament from Eastern Ontario, but a former mayor from the region and a longtime Conservative advisor. He's on my leadership team and in fact runs our daily strategy in the House of Commons, which lately has been driving the Liberals crazy. So great work, Eric. He's also been a passionate and relentless advocate in the fight to end the discriminatory blood ban against gay men. Over the course of 6 years and 2 election campaigns, Mr. Trudeau has promised to end this blood ban, but he and the Liberal government have refused to follow through, and we've been holding them to account. And as I have said, from the first few minutes I became party leader back in August of last year, I want the Conservative Party to represent Canada of 2021 and the hopes, fears, and aspirations of all Canadians. Under my leadership, Canada's Conservatives will continue to stand up for the equal rights of the LGBTQ community and to put pressure to end the blood ban, to work on the Rainbow Road and other initiatives where we can partner. During Pride Month this year, I've also been very proud to show that our Conservative team will be there for the community. And I hope that we can work together to ensure that LGBTQ Canadians are better represented at all levels of government and certainly feel welcome and an important place in our party. That said, all Canadians deserve better. We need to see a return after the challenges of this last year of Canadian ingenuity, optimism, self-ability. But most of all, we need to see a return of Canadian leadership for the well-being of our citizens, leadership on economic prosperity, leadership to bring unity back to a country that is suffering from some divisions. The very future of Canada is at stake, and coming out of COVID-19, our country in many ways is at a crossroads. Soon Canadians will have to decide which path at those crossroads we want to take. Is it the more of big deficits, more debt, higher taxes, more ethical scandals, less opportunity of Mr. Trudeau? Or will Canadians choose a different, more steady and certain path to securing our future? That's the path I'm talking about where we can deliver us a Canada where those who've struggled the most through this pandemic can get back to work. This spring, our party introduced Canada's Recovery Plan, a 5-point plan to secure our future after COVID. The first pillar, a Conservative government will enact a comprehensive jobs plan to recover the 1 million jobs lost during the pandemic. We know we can reach that target within 1 year. Despite Canada being home to over 28,000 businesses operated by members of the LGBTQ community, there are still many barriers facing entrepreneurs and many of those small business owners. It's imperative that you have a government who will stand with you and is committed to help businesses that have been struggling thrive after COVID-19. We have specific policies that will help rebuild the main streets of Canada and assist small and medium-sized businesses by providing incentives to build, invest in, and even start new businesses. We will also take immediate action in the hardest hit sectors, helping those who've suffered the most in tourism, hospitality, and many small businesses. That would include many members of the LGBTQ community. It also includes women and young people in higher numbers. We need to address these acute business challenges to ensure that these businesses survive so that they can thrive as our economy recovers in the longer term. The second pillar of our plan will enact the toughest accountability and transparency laws in Canadian history. From the Prime Minister's office, the subject of multiple scandals and 3 ethics investigations, to the Canadian Armed Forces, where the last 2 chiefs of defense staff have had to resign. Canadians want accountability, transparency, and trust in these important institutions restored. Our third pillar, the last year has deepened Canada's mental health crisis. Struggles with isolation and loneliness are among the top factors affecting mental health in Canada. This rings even more true for the LGBTQ community and many youth who have historically lived with higher rates of anxiety, depression, and other mental health challenges. We need to address what could be a tsunami of mental health challenges coming after vaccines and after the pandemic. We understand the need for better mental health services, and that's why in our plan, we will introduce a Canada Mental Health Action Plan that boosts funding partnerships with the provinces, but also with nonprofit groups on the ground for mental wellness. Nonprofit groups like the 519 in Toronto, who are already warning of the need to support more mental health supports for the LGBTQ community post-COVID. Fourth, our party will ensure our country is never again unprepared for a crisis. A Conservative government will make Canada more resilient, reduce our reliance on countries like Communist China, and take our responsibility seriously to protect the health of Canadians. This includes enhancing domestic capacity in vaccines and other critical medicines on top of strategic stockpiles and a restart of the pandemic warning system. Finally, a Conservative government will secure Canada's economy by getting the budget back to balance over the course of the next decade. Spending to protect Canadians during the pandemic is the right thing to do, and Conservatives have done that in opposition. But we cannot pass unsustainable debt to our children and to future generations. The spending in the Liberals' election budget is so astronomical that it puts the future of our country at risk. It puts growth at risk. It puts jobs at risk. Healthcare and old age security are at risk. The Prime Minister is testing an out-of-control debt plan without any real stimulus, no fiscal anchor, and he's doing this at a time where inflation is at a 10-year high and interest rate increases are on the horizon. Canadians, especially those looking for a home in the GTA or GVR or other parts of this country, can't afford the same tired approach from the Trudeau Liberals and their partners in the NDP. Their Ottawa knows best approach will drive taxes higher, increase housing pressures, add to the risks of inflation, and increasingly will leave millions of Canadians out of a COVID-19 economic recovery. Therefore, we believe once the recovery starts, we need to get spending under control. That's what a Conservative government will do. We'll get the economy growing again to secure the revenue needed to pay for the government services Canadians depend on. Recently, I was also very proud to release the Conservative Plan for the Environment and Climate Change. The Trudeau government and their approach has generally been larger government, taxing consumers, and phasing out jobs at a time that we need them the most. The Conservative approach will price carbon for consumers and for business, and will empower Canadians, and will reduce emissions while preserving jobs and GDP growth in all parts of the country. In fact, we took time to work with a BC-based climate change modeling firm to verify that the Conservative Climate Change Plan will achieve the same emission reductions as the Liberal government's current plan, will make our Paris commitments, but will have vastly better outcomes when it comes to job creation and the economy. Smart policy. The decisions we take in the next few years will define Canada for this generation and the next. And as the father of 2 young kids, I want to make sure we leave the country in a better state for them than how we found it. That's what drives me, and I'm sure that's what drives your members from coast to coast, making sure that we have an economic recovery from COVID that includes everyone, that addresses inequalities, and that addresses some of the lingering challenges like mental health. That's why after COVID-19, Canada deserves certainty and competent leadership, a party that will champion unity, inclusivity, excellence, and prosperity, a recovery plan that will get the economy back on track in all parts of the country, and a government that will be focused on the well-being of all of its citizens, not on the well-being of those insiders, lobbyists, and close connected to the Trudeau government. It's time for an ethical government again. Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity, Dale, and I look forward to taking some questions.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. O'Toole, and I appreciate your opening statement. So for everyone who's attending, I would encourage you to please, if you have a question for Mr. O'Toole, please do submit one, and I'll do my best to get an answer. Mr. O'Toole, we did take submissions before in the run-up to this webinar as well. So I want to get right into some questions already submitted, if that's okay. And the first is, it's on the record of the Conservative Party. The previous Conservative government, led by Prime Minister Harper, had a mixed relationship with the LGBT plus community, and you were likely the first leader in a long time to start making proactive declarations of support for our community. So can I ask you first, why now, and are you making this a priority for your leadership?
Well, that's a good question, Dale. We do have to win some trust in the LGBTQ community. No question about it. I've said that right from the start of my leadership. In fact, my speech at 1:30 in the morning to an empty room, because I'm a COVID era leader, I get Zoom or I get empty rooms. That's changing, thankfully. But in that speech, I mentioned specifically I wanted more people from the LGBTQ community to look at our party as a vehicle to champion issues that matter to them. And my record has been very clear as an ally. And I know it will take some time to build trust, but I'm committed to that. I'm very proud, as I said, that Eric's on my leadership team, that he's taking a lead on advancing some issues that the community is concerned about. And I want anyone that decides maybe to vote for us or not to vote for us to be welcome to make that decision based on policy and plans, not based on a sense that they're not welcome or included. And so I'm committed to that as leader. And where does that come from? It's an important issue for me because as a young kid of my generation, I really grew to become a champion and an ally through my time in the Canadian Armed Forces, where I served alongside members of the LGBTQ community, even at a time where it was very difficult for many of them to be open about their orientation. Yet they wanted to put their country first. Even amidst discrimination, they were willing to actually put their life on the line. So when I got into politics, I said, I will certainly put my political life on the line to stand up for equality rights for all Canadians. And so hopefully people see we're sincere. We are a party on the center-right, so we do have a free market focus. We like smaller, more effective government. We like accountability and transparency. We like to reward innovation, but take care of the vulnerable. So we, I think, are a great outlet for many members of the LGBTQ community, but they have to know that we're reaching out. So great opportunities like this is part of it, Dale.
And Mr. O'Toole, do you think the Conservative Party could have done more to support the LGBT plus community in the past?
There are probably times that we could have, yes. And I think the one thing I'm very proud of, and I think our society can be, is that we are addressing some of the issues with respect to discrimination. Our party supported and took part in the apology to members of the LGBTQ community that were actually discriminated against, and in some cases run out of federal institutions like the military and government services. I think we have to address those periods, and we have. And society is coming a long way. We've got a long way to go, but my Pride video, which I hope you've seen, we decided to use the mural of the We Demand movement that began before I was born, actually. And there's been a lot accomplished. There's still a journey to take, but I do think that the advocacy of the community has had an impact on our inclusivity and of our potential as a country. And so I think all parties, including mine, could have been there better in the past. And so it makes me redouble our efforts to make sure that inclusivity and diversity is more than just a slogan. I've been willing to stand even when I've been in a minority in my party, but I'm very proud that it's now the majority, the vast majority. So we're headed in the right direction, and I want to partner to keep us on the journey.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. Turning now to your economic philosophy, you mentioned the party is center-right. So I want to get to your economic vision for the country and where LGBT plus businesses and entrepreneurs feature in it. So I'm eager to explore your philosophy, your beliefs. Do you support policies of affirmative action? Well, I think we want to make sure there's no barriers to opportunity. And, my team has briefed me on the fact that sexual orientation and other factors are still highly used as ways of barriers of entry to the workforce. And that needs to be stamped out. How that is done is the method to get there. And we would support a healthy discussion about that, attaining targets. It might surprise people, but when I was in cabinet as a Conservative minister, I was the last minister appointed by Mr. Harper. We actually assessed our ordering council appointments for diversity. We probably didn't have the reputation for that at the time, but we did, and it's important. So we would be committed to working with the community to make sure barriers are removed, to make sure there's more representation at all levels of the civil service or of industry, particularly regulated industry. And as a leader that runs an organization myself, I'm not just talking the talk, I'm walking the talk as well. We are going to have more representation in the next parliament in our caucus from the LGBTQ community. Eric is a trailblazer, but I'm happy that he will be joined by some folks that will also help advocate and work on public policy development as well. Mr. O'Toole, we represent a vulnerable and underrepresented economic group, as you outlined in your opening remarks, and the unique challenges that we face. We face those challenges that other mainstream entrepreneurs do not. So would you support targeted measures of support to increase representation for LGBT plus people in the business community and in our economy?
Well, that's a reiteration of the previous question, and yes, but we would explore how to do it. Our party generally doesn't like just affixing a quota approach to things, because that often makes people think that barriers have been removed when it actually may not address the barriers. and it may allow for a sort of bureaucratic response to a structural or a systemic problem. So how can we advance participation, make sure there's equality, and we see, it's important for me to work with the community so that members of the LGBTQ community can see their community reflected in management and in government. It's also an area where, unlike Mr. Trudeau, I dive into the issues and actually try and make sure my commitments and promises are based on what I can deliver. As you know, most of the workforce is provincially regulated. And so how can we, at a federal government level, something we actually control, make sure that we see better representation from the community and from underrepresented, historically marginalized groups? We are completely committed to that, Dale. It's how we can achieve that and put pressure to break down barriers. There's a great McKinsey report that actually shows organizations that embrace and leverage diversity, studied, have 15% better economic performance over time. Yeah. So as a free market conservative, I'm willing to extol the virtues and put pressure to be part of the solution. But as I said, this is where we'll have to work with all levels of government, with nonprofits, with the civil service, and potentially barriers in the private and nonprofit sectors. So we'll have to have a comprehensive approach, and we're committed to being part of that.
That's great. A reminder to attendees if you have a question for Mr. O'Toole, please ask, and I will do my best to weave it into our conversation here. Mr. O'Toole, one of the ways and one of the tools to increase LGBT plus inclusion from a business perspective is around inclusive procurement, and specifically supplier diversity. It's a key program for CGLCC and the work we do to support LGBT plus businesses across Canada, connecting LGBT plus businesses with corporate Canada and government. Can you tell me, where do you stand on supplier diversity? Do you support the concept?
Yes, I do, Dale. In fact, I've talked a lot about it in, gosh, my 8 years as an MP. Now, more with respect to Indigenous reconciliation, and I've actually made some proposals with respect to Indigenous run or managed businesses in supply chains, making that a requirement of federal procurement as part of economic reconciliation. But that same approach, I'm very open to leveraging for other groups that have been historically underrepresented. The federal government, and this is something, as I said, I can give you a more firm answer here because it's something that's directly in our control when it comes to federal procurement. The billions spent on defense procurement, for example, we already have a way of assessing industrial and regional benefits. We can also tie some of those assessed benefits in procurement to partnerships and supply chain networks with Indigenous, with LGBTQ, with Black-run businesses. Very much open to that, and I actually think that is fundamentally a bit of a conservative approach to empowering some private sector opportunities to address historical wealth inequality, opportunity inequality. I think there's some great potential here. We will need to shake up a lazy and quite frankly, archaic procurement system within the federal government. That's why we're slower than most of the world on vaccines. We're catching up now, but we have a glacial and opaque approach to procurement, and I will fix it. I will be a very hands-on prime minister that brings my experience and commitments to bear to actually deliver, not just announce. The Trudeau government are experts at announcing, very poor at delivering, and the blood ban is a great example of that.
So then, just to clarify, Mr. O'Toole, do you believe that the federal government should initiate a procurement policy that actively and intentionally looks to diversify the federal supply chain? And then should LGBT plus businesses be a part of that?
I think there's an opportunity, yes, to make sure that federal procurement has baked into it the public policy goal to encourage and enhance participation from supply chain businesses owned, operated, or committed to programs of inclusion. As I said, I've talked about this for many years on the Indigenous front, but yes, we're open to the LGBTQ community as well. As I said, I think this dovetails very well with our approach to smarter, more effective government services, more transparency. I think a lot of Canadians would like to know that the billions being spent federally by their government, from the military to public works to the Arctic to transport, also has a secondary public policy goal related to inclusion. I don't think those are mutually exclusive at all. I think this is something we would be committed to. And if you've seen my approach, particularly on mental health, I'm also a firm believer of the government partnering with outside organizations, not just for policy planning, but for governance to make sure that we meet our objectives. So I would actually invite groups like yours to hold us to account.
We shall do our best. And then, leveraging what you just said a moment ago, the government has a very big voice. Would you be willing to encourage or even require corporate Canada to include inclusive procurement policies like what happens in the US? It happens down south, and it's something which could really show that the government kind of means business in this area.
Well, I think there can be a way the government shows they mean business through getting our own house in order, our own procurement. Mm-hmm. But this goes back to our earlier discussion. I'm very frank. We don't like a government having a grand announcement about we're establishing quotas and you won't even know if they're achieved. And with private sector capital, I know, having spent 10 years in the private sector, that if you try and force something on it, there may be resistance, there may be expansion in other operations. How can we make it more collaborative? Certainly set the agenda without declaring and enforcing something that may not be easy to achieve on a government imposed timeline. So this is where, as a free market center right party, we like more minimal intrusion. But if we have a federal framework that requires, for example, if you want to bid on federal procurement, we would like to see an established commitment to representation, for example. That would lead those suppliers, if they're doing it for the federal government, they would then have those systems internally for all of their market operations, including in the private sector, in that tendering world as well. If they're establishing a commitment to workplace equality for women in management or board positions, if they're including issues with respect to the LGBTQ community and others, we would then have that regime enforced by the federal requirements, but those companies would still operate in the private sector. So it's an area, I'm just being transparent with you. I think we can do a lot by demonstrating a commitment federally and then tying it to federal procurement without us getting into something that has provincial jurisdiction, federal jurisdiction, private capital markets. But I'll tell you, I'm friends with some of the folks involved in the Ontario Security Commission's reform on inclusion and engagement. So I think these conversations are leading to progress, and we want to be part of that.
Turning to COVID-19, I know everyone's sick of hearing about COVID-19, but we have some questions that have come in about it. And as you know, COVID-19 has decimated the economy for many entrepreneurs, but we know diverse-owned businesses have been hit harder. They've lost more revenue, more people have been laid off, and more businesses have been closed down. So, Mr. O'Toole, a question here is, looking back, how would you have done things differently for LGBT plus entrepreneurs? Would you have been supportive of targeted funding, such as funding that was announced for women, Indigenous and Black-owned businesses?
Well, what would I do differently in the pandemic? And going way back, that could be a 2-hour discussion. But for businesses in highly affected sectors, and as I said in my remarks, because of the very hard impact on travel, tourism, hospitality, and a range of service industries. The LGBTQ community has been higher represented in terms of entrepreneurs, women, and our approach would be targeted program for those sectors. We've been advocating for this actually literally within months of my becoming leader, because we supported the federal government's overall programming, getting money out the door to help people with the wage subsidy, the CERB, and rent supports and others. But as the pandemic evolved, we have been consistently advocating and quite frankly, very frustrated that the government has not actually taken in the data that is out there to learn some sectors, professional services like Bay Street, for example. There was an initial threat, there was worries about solvency, but in many firms, and I'm doing outreach, they're having record years because their costs low. So the government probably before the second wave even hit, Dale, should have pivoted the programming to make sure that use of public dollars was more focused on people that were highly, highly impacted. And many entrepreneurs that may be members of your chamber would be that target. And what that would have done is it would have taken the money away from the private sector players that didn't need it and actually doubled or tripled the impact. Use travel tourism, for example. Mm-hmm. Highest hit will have the slowest recovery. Hospitality is slowly limping back now, but tourism, and particularly tourism that in some of our larger cities that relies on some international-based tourism, they will have the slowest recovery, and they need specifically targeted programs. The fact that in the last few days of this parliament, a 2-year late budget is being delivered by the Liberals, and they likely will get it passed and implemented on their last day because of their slowness, not ours. They haven't even targeted highly affected sectors. So that wouldn't be a specific BIPOC or LGBTQ or a specific set of funds, but it would be hyper targeted where we know there's a higher representation of ownership and leadership by members of the community. And I think it would have had a huge help.
So just to go a bit deeper on that then. So for diverse-owned businesses, LGBT entrepreneurs, who we know, and as you referenced in your opening remarks, face unique challenges on top of the challenges already faced by entrepreneurs across the length and breadth of the country, a Conservative government would not have given targeted supports directly to those type of entrepreneurs. You would have focused more on the sectors that they would have been more concentrated in. Is that right?
That's one partial way to describe it. The systemic longer term issues that you're referring to, and we talked about in previous questions with respect to better representation, more equitable access to supply chain networks, other things. We shouldn't use acute emergency pandemic funding for issues that we actually should bake into budgets over the next 5 to 10 years to address some of the structural issues. And I think this is something that people are going to get straight answers from me, having worked on business restructurings as a new lawyer, including the restructuring of Air Canada. I know that when you're in an emergency situation, that is not the time for addressing the long-term issue. So when I say ours would have been highly affected sector funding, it's not a way of saying the structural inequalities aren't important. It's let's get through this pandemic. Let's make sure your members are solvent 8 months from now, Dale. That's got to be the hyper targeting of funding during COVID. And where the Trudeau government has failed miraculously badly has been when they've tried to have some specific, like the We Charity scandal came from, let's engage young people in philanthropic and volunteer activities with this $1 billion fund. That's where things fell down in a crisis, in an emergency. Let's get direct supports. We know it will help in a higher proportion members of the LGBTQ community, but the longer term structural problems, let's also recommit to that apart from the emergency funds from COVID.
Mr. O'Toole, turning to tourism, we have a bunch of questions that have come in since you made some comments to tourism. And we know LGBT plus tourism it's estimated to be around worth around $12 billion in Canada every year in a survey conducted by Crestview Strategy. And we know that LGBT plus tourists are actually one of the first categories to bounce back after big shocks. You referenced tourism being the hardest hit, but the longest recovery. Well, LGBT plus tourists are actually one of the first to recover. Post 9/11, post SARS, the data shows that. So the question here is, what would you do to support LGBT plus tourism, and how do you see that playing its part in COVID recovery?
Well, I think those are interesting stats, after 9/11 and other things. I'm very much a metrics-driven leader. Like I worked for Procter & Gamble for 5 years, a company that was an amazing, diverse employer. And I saw the strength of diversity, and we also measured and tracked everything. So using that type of data is smart. I was on the radio this morning with Victoria, BC, and of course the bypassing of Vancouver and Vancouver Island of the Alaska cruise ship industry, mainly because the Trudeau government didn't have a national system for rapid screening and testing set up, is a huge miss. So is there an ability to build into Destinations Canada and some of our national tourism strategy a specific item to quickly reignite and accelerate the opportunities with the LGBTQ community? That would be a smart use of targeted marketing funds. And my worry is, by the time international tourism returns to normal, some of those highly impacted sectors may not have held on. Going back to my previous question or my previous answer, the highly affected sectors, Restaurants Canada has warned of 60% of restaurants being insolvent in the next 6 months if there wasn't some hyper targeting of supports. It's the same with tourism. I've spoken to tourism operators in almost all of the provinces, hanging on by a thread now. So when we have the ability to ramp up more targeted travel, including from LGBTQ community, including internationally, we need to make sure those businesses are still on their feet.
Mr. O'Toole, as part of the current government's trade diversification strategy, they've made a large commitment to inclusive trade, encouraging and supporting diverse-owned businesses, including LGBT plus-owned businesses, in accessing global markets. And we have a question here from one of our members who has benefited from that. And the question is, what is your opinion on expanding trade opportunities? Do you believe there should be targeted efforts to ensure that LGBT plus businesses are part of that?
I think our commitment is to make sure, yes, all abilities to leverage the federal government and trade trips, some of the work we do on developing overseas markets, free trade agreements. I worked on those issues as a fairly new MP because I had worked on trade in the private sector. Therefore, I was given the chance to work on the European trade deal and others. Absolutely. This is something I actually don't think we're doing well enough. The Trade Commissioner's Service, which also helps facilitate this, is in need of an update. I hear that regularly from a lot of industry sectors. I'm assuming that it's probably not living up to some of the underrepresented groups as much as it could be. This is an area where I think you're going to see a real commitment from us, because whenever we can demonstrate our commitment to inclusivity and leverage our own political brand as free market, entrepreneurial, free traders, we will look to partner. So yeah, we would continue and probably enhance some of those programs and then measure them, including with some governance from outside nonprofits and chambers, to make sure that, as I said, the government just doesn't announce things and have a good intention. I want to see the follow through.
Mr. O'Toole, I'm conscious that we are coming very close to our time, and there is just one or two more questions I'd like to ask. So, your party has been quite vocal on the gay blood ban, a ban on gay men and men who have sex with men from donating blood if they've had sex in the past 3 months. And Eric Duncan, as you mentioned at the start of the call, has been spearheading this campaign. Why is this a big issue for you, and what needs to happen?
Well, it's the right thing to do. It's an important issue for one of my leadership team members, Eric, and it's an important issue for me. And sure, when I've asked the Prime Minister directly this in the House, and I get some heckles from him and his seatmates. And I hope this demonstrates that, sure, we have some trust to build with the LGBTQ community, but the fact that I'm willing to take the condescension from Mr. Trudeau to hold him to account on a commitment he made 6 years ago to the community, I hope demonstrates our commitment. Eric asked some very impassioned questions in the House, just showing how hollow the promise has been to someone like him. And he and many other gay men have talked about their own personal experience and how they felt ostracized. Other countries, including the UK, which often we look to as our peer and our Five Eyes ally, have moved to a much fairer, less discriminatory, open way to secure the security of the blood supply, but end discrimination. Eric has not only advocated it, he's recently introduced a private member's bill that actually shows the government exactly how to do it using existing regulation. And Eric's on the call if you want any more detail, but he knows he has the full backing of me as leader. There is literally no excuse. This is within the purview of Minister Haiju directly. And so this will show whether there's a commitment beyond positive intentions. And I would never suggest that Mr. Trudeau does not care. This is my main issue, and this is perhaps why I raise these issues. I believe he wants to end the boil water advisories on reserve too, but we need a Prime Minister that has a plan to live up to their words, and that's what we often don't have with Mr. Trudeau.
Mr. O'Toole, I know we are just out of time. Do you have time for one last question?
Sure.
One last question. So the question that came in here is around the LGBTQ2 Secretariat, which is working in Canadian heritage with LGBTQ2 stakeholders across the country. So very quickly, very simple, as Prime Minister, would you keep support and funding for the LGBTQ2 Secretariat?
Yes. In fact, if you look at my Pride video, I talked about within the span of the last half century, the advocacy work done with the We Demand proposals and legislative mandate. That is part of our heritage as a country. The rights, our commitment to rights, liberty, to equality, freedom. I think these are core conservative values, and sometimes in the past we haven't lived up to them to the degree I would like. We have to, as a country, make sure that that's part of our story, our history, our heritage, and so some of that advocacy we would maintain. And as I've said, I think my goal as leader is to make sure my party, the things we're advocating for, is part of that agenda of inclusivity. And whenever the country is formally telling our story through the Department of Heritage and some of our cultural outreach, that should be an important part of it.
Well, Mr. O'Toole, I want to be respectful of your time, and I want to say thank you on behalf of CGLCC, Canada's LGBT+ Chamber of Commerce, for being a good sport and joining us here today for, I think, which was a great conversation. We covered a lot of topics, and there's so much more we could go through, but Erin O'Toole, the Honourable Erin O'Toole, leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, thank you very much for being with us today on CGLCC Connects, and happy Pride.
Well, thank you, Dale. I was hoping when you first invited me after that Canadian Club lunch that we could not be on Zooms by the time I did this, but happy Pride. The light is at the end of the tunnel in terms of vaccines and openings. And I just, on behalf of our party, Eric and myself, I want to pass along a happy Pride and a happy Coming Canada Day, and best health to all your members and their families.
And I believe Eric has just come on camera. Please say hello, Eric.
Hello, everybody. Hello, leader, and thank you for the mentions there, and thank you, Dale, for putting this together. It's great to see everybody, and